The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below. Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor, Thomas Goss, welcoming you back to the Planets Orchestration Analysis series. Today we're going to move on to Saturn, which is the favorite movement of a lot of composers out there. It has some really amazing orchestration in it, and it's almost the core, if you will, of the planets, where Jupiter is something of a big explosion of energy and joy and fun and everything else. A lot of people feel that there's something a little vapid about it, that it doesn't quite fulfill its promise. And I'm not one of those, but it's just something that I have seen or read in criticism of the planets. Whereas, on the other hand, those same critics tend to love Saturn. And what I feel about it is that we are seeing different parts of Holst's sensibilities and personality coming to the fore, and he's just introspecting artistically. There's something worth mentioning about what Saturn means culturally. And Jupiter kind of takes the place, to a sense, of the old gods of fertility. I believe that the oldest gods were Uranus and Gaia. So the heavens would fertilize the earth with rain and so on. And that became more and more sophisticated when we see different gods deposing each other in Greek mythology, for instance. What we're really seeing is different cultures, perhaps, coming in and out of a certain region and imposing their new gods onto the old gods, right? Saturn was considered to be the god of the harvest, and that actually makes him a sort of a positive figure initially. But as is usual with such things, the sense of what a harvest means became more and more symbolic in a way. So if Saturn is the god that makes it possible for humans to harvest their crops, then in a way he is the timekeeper. He's the person who basically decides when a certain thing comes to an end. And this goes back to the Greek counterpart of Saturn, which is Cronus, right? So the which we get our word chronology and chronometer and so on from. So yeah, so in the sense of god of time, well, people don't want their fun times to end or their time on this earth to end. So he became associated more and more with something that brings things to an end, right? That doesn't necessarily mean death. That's what, a lot of people kind of jump to the conclusion a little too quickly. Certainly in the sense of Saturn being used as the bringer of old age. Time brings maturity, right? So whether or not you're going to look at that as emotional maturity or physical maturity, that's the symbology at work there, right? So think about that and how that actually applies to the music in this movement. I wouldn't bring it up if there wasn't some aspect that was worth thinking about in our lecture. And from the first, you can see that there's a bit of a tick-tock going on here, right? They're like the second hand of a clock kind of going back and forth. And that sense of pacing goes throughout this movement up to about halfway. So think about those things. One last thing that I will say before we jump into the orchestration analysis, and that is that this may be the very first thing that Holst worked on. I believe that I've read that somewhere, that the sketches for Saturn were among the oldest of all the planets. So they seem to have been inspired by Holst listening to a performance of the Schoenberg Five Pieces for Orchestra, which were basically focusing on orchestral effects and just using sounds and harmonies and so on to create different psychological and different audio effects, really. And that is a piece that I would love to analyze in detail, but I'm just not so sure that everybody is ready for it in the community. But we'll talk about that in the future. Maybe I'll put it up to a vote or something. Anyhow, that was really the inspiration for this entire piece. And originally it was going to be called Seven Pieces for Orchestra by Gustav Holst as a bit of a reminder, or some number of pieces for orchestra. But gradually the forces of astrology, or at least Holst's interest in astrology, took over. With that, let's jump into the orchestration. Starting off with an analysis of our orchestra, just looking and seeing what are the forces that are going to be used. We're back to 6 horns and 4 trumpets and a full bevy of trombones, plus just a single bass tuba. So you can take it for granted if it's bass trombone and tuba, it's almost like bass trombone and bass tuba, right? Is the sense here when there's a tenor tuba at play. But pretty much everybody is going to default to bass trombone and tuba, meaning a bass tuba involved. And 6 timpani, just like Jupiter, with 2 players trading off between 3 kettles each. Now here it says bells, and what's meant here is tubular bells, and not glockenspiel. I have seen this used from time to time, and in fact, I've even carelessly once or twice referred to tubular bells just as bells, and had people say orchestral bells always means glockenspiel and, trying to confuse us and so on. Well, here's an example right here of bells, meaning tubular bells. And it just has to do with the way that publishers in certain countries and certain periods of time choose to name their instruments. And it's just really not worth hassling about, and we don't have time in our lives to worry about those things, so this is probably the only time I'm going to bring it up, besides the answer that I made to 1 or 2 people over the years who have taken issue with me occasionally just using the word bell to refer to a tubular bell. I mean, seriously, people, you just do not have time in your lives, and I don't have time. There might be dozens of questions out there that challenge me on one thing I've said or another in YouTube comments, and I just don't have time for that, to answer every single one. Sometimes it's fun to, if there's a good answer and a good exchange, and I know that people really aren't out to get me. It's just that we are all very obsessive over points of terminology. Because why? We're geeks. Geeks of orchestration. Anyhow, then 2 harps and organ pedal. So that's the middle of our orchestra, okay? And interestingly enough, there are some very soft, very delicate sections of this particular piece, but there is no celesta, even though the framing of it could very well use celesta. But as we saw in the introduction to this series, when you have big brass in this particular suite of pieces, then there's a tendency to avoid celesta, and wisely, I believe. Then, of course, we've got our complement of strings. We've got 3 flutes and bass flute, no piccolo. 2 oboes, English horn, and bass oboe. It's nice to have the bass oboe back. 3 clarinets, bass clarinet. 3 bassoons, contrabassoon. All right, so that is the palette with which this piece starts. So just on the face of it, you might think that, wow, this is going to be a massive piece. Well, it will be massive in a while, but it starts off with this very delicate alternation of chords. What's very cool about this to a listener who has never heard it before is the sense that this is the downbeat. right? 1, 2, or if you're thinking cut time, or 1, 2, 3, 4, if you're thinking in 4, 4. And that illusion is going to be shattered after they start hearing these phrases start to unfold. But that is a sort of a delightful thing. There are like rock songs and opera music and symphonic pieces that start with a sort of an offbeat rhythm and then show you where the downbeat is, so that the downbeat at first feels like an offbeat. I love that effect. I think it's cool. I've never used it myself, but maybe someday it would be fun to explore, to see how long I could push the illusion that the melody was the offbeat against the actual offbeat of the accompaniment. Now, I love this right in here. Double bass featured line. And later on, I believe these are marked soli, right? Well, they are here because there's nothing else going on, right? So, but it's sort of not even worth mentioning that this is a solo, right? Not a solo double bass, a single double bass, but the section soli. Let's look at the way that this is scored, though. Now, notice something, and that is we've got the harps notated down an octave from the flutes. And then don't forget your transposition. Bass flute in G, actually alto flute, right? So, and even I just carelessly said bass flute a second ago, following what was written in the score, correct? So, reading down a fourth, you end up getting an A instead of a written D, right? And this is an A an octave lower in the second harp. And this is perfectly acceptable. Similarly, if you're just going to have a row like this that just goes on and on and on. This is the kind of scoring where in the part, you might want to mark how many bars go on, right? So I would say just write a 1 over this, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and then just keep going, so that the player can keep track of where they are. That's way, way better than doing the slash and then 2 dots, because that conveys no information. Don't try to save space in a part just to get a page turn or to boil down the entire part to 1 page or something. Really write out everything for a wind player or a string player, brass player. Only do repeat bar in certain circumstances, which I'm going to write a tip on in 100 more orchestration tips. Now you might think, well, look, these are an octave apart, but they're not. Holst intends this to be the played pitch sounding an octave higher. And that is actually what a lot of harpists prefer. They want to see where to put their fingers. They know that it's going to sound an octave higher. Sometimes it's not really clear, and you sort of have to get through context what type of scoring is intended. But in this case, it's very, very clear. Now, moving on, the double basses become divisi octaves, and they hand this off to the violins and violas all on the same pitch, sort of a triple unison. And it dovetails right here, and almost seamlessly, I feel. Now, both of these expressions here by the violins feel a bit unearthly and unnatural, and I think that's done on purpose. Same thing here with the cellos, all right? So what is going on here? Well, first we start off just double basses, rock bottom, beautiful soli passage. Okay, changing to octaves. And double basses playing octaves really has a different sound than double basses and cellos. It just really has this heavy weight. And that's such a great choice for this very mysterious sounding passage. Then trading off on the same B, so remember written B for the double basses, sounds down an octave, dovetailing at an octave below concert Bs, but that's okay because this is reaching up in the context of the listener to this B, right? This is going F, B, this is going F, B to these strings here. So the upper strings are just completing the phrase by the double basses. What's lovely here is the amount of time that Holst gives these violins and violas to just really push this note up to forte and back. And it's just so much more powerful than if this had been written like mezzo forte, right? Or if this had started mezzo piano and gone to forte. To really give the strings a big, beautiful arc dynamically. That's just a wonderful thing. If you're the kind of composer that writes a lot of mezzo fortes and a lot of mezzo pianos in your score, this is why not to do it. Because it just robs the notes that you're writing from effectiveness if you do it all the time. I'm not saying you should never write mezzo piano, mezzo forte, but I just keep getting scores from people that are like all mezzo dynamics. There might be one or two pianos or fortes, or maybe the occasional fortissimo, but just everything is mezzo piano or mezzo forte, right? So the orchestra never goes anywhere dynamically. So as long as I keep seeing it in scores that people send me, I'm going to keep complaining about it. So here's an example of why you could just avoid that kind of thinking and just really get a beautiful effect, just a burning effect. Just scorches as it's going that many players on the same single note, right? You have to think that this is going to be a massive orchestra. So you're going to have at least 30 violin players and, maybe another 12 to 14 violas, right? So, so think, over 40 players are just pushing this crescendo, and it just sounds fantastic. Doesn't need to have mutes or any other kind of thing. Really, really lovely. Now, what I love is this right here. Solo oboe, playing this very, very simple idea. And, we've seen that here, too. It's just a rise of a second and back, a minor second. Solo oboe dovetails into violoncellos, who then push up to a forte from pianissimo. That just is amazing. The cellos appear to be coming out of the oboes. Speaking of oboes, we have our first real bass oboe solo. And Holst chooses a very conservative place to put that solo, because he's taking absolutely zero chances with his bass oboe. Back then, some other English composers, notably Delius, were really relying on bass oboe. Holst doesn't seem to be all that sure about it. And it could be for reasons that I've outlined in other educational writings that I've done, tips and so on, commentary. And that is that it might have been hard to really find a functioning bass oboe. At that point, they probably would be using like a Luray bass oboe, baritone oboe, I should say, rather than a Heckel, the Heckel phone. Those have been the two options that were available to people. It was only recently that we got the Lupophone, which is really an incredible instrument. But here, it's just really the sparsest of notes. It really doesn't do a whole lot, but just a few notes. But they are magical. They are just wonderful, this unearthly sound here. And it's beautifully showcased by everything, coming off the tail end of these high cellos. Holst gives the bass clarinetist the option of playing the part instead if there is no bass oboe available. He's just really aware that bass oboe is not a thing that every orchestra has, or that most orchestras would have back then. And indeed, the situation has scarcely been remedied to a degree. It's not like every piece that calls for bass oboe can really depend on there having to be one. And it's good that there are options, but I'll tell you, as much as I love bass clarinet, here I feel that this particular substitution is not that effective. But if he were to put in bassoon there, it just really wouldn't sound right, I feel. It's a more strikingly individual sound to put in bass clarinet rather than bassoon. So the best he could do, I suppose. And it's lovely how bass oboe climbs up here to written F, then up to written B, which is the same note as this F sharp. So the first horn is kind of dovetailing in. It's a lovely trading off. Let's listen to all of that. This actually is going to take some time because this is such a slow piece, adagio, and really each of these musical breaks that we take is going to be longer than we normally have had in the past, except for maybe Venus, which was also slow. Let's have a listen to that now. Listen for all of those things. The uniqueness of the double basses soli, how they sound in divisi octaves, the way that the upper strings take over on the implied phrase up to B, and then just the wonderful sound of them pushing into this crescendo and coming back out again. Then how the oboe gives way to our cellos, and how the cellos push, and right under the cellos, here comes the bass oboe, which itself dovetails into the horns. And then I'll see you on the next screen. Now here, just before rehearsal figure 1 in Roman numerals, the horns come in and they dovetail into the flutes to a degree, right? The G sharp here, concert G sharp, is the same as this D sharp there. The D is the same as the A, and so on and so forth. And this is one of those wonderful moments. If you've got top-notch players, then you really hear that great giving over of the tonalities. And if it's done smoothly enough, it's magical. Because there is a relationship between flute tone and horn tone. So if your horn players are really able to control their dynamic and just sensitively merge right out from the flutes, there's just nothing like it. It's really, I just feel, an amazing effect. And there are other moments like that, like for instance here, where the trombones give way to the horns, if the players are really in sync, then it's not going to just sound like, hey, there were trombones here and now there are trumpets there. The trumpets and the trombones are going to realize that because of this transition here, they should try to simulate each other's tone as much as possible so that it's very, very smooth. And it helps that the first trombone is the lower voice of this chorale. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, though. Pizzicato octaves in lower strings, and I just really love this, continuing on with the idea of keeping time, the sort of tick-tock pacing that is going through this entire piece. And we have just the heart of somberness here, with the trombones starting a 3-voice chorale, just beautifully serious and calm. Notice how it's built out of the opening fragment of theme, right? Bum, 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 bum. Right? Very similar to what we heard in the basses, but we take it farther. Bum, 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 bum. Yeah, just really a wonderful thematic idea. And as I said before, a great orchestra will make this feel seamless. It won't just feel like, hey, the trumpets are taking over now. The trumpets will just really get in tune with the trombones. I think that's the way that it's done with Montreal under Dutoit. He has such a keen ear on that album. A lot of people actually don't like that album. There are others that they prefer. I was actually raised on the Sir Adrian Boult recording of the 60s, I believe. I'm trying to think, because my father bought a lot of LPs. And I think that was an early 60s recording with Adrian Boult and possibly... was that the London Symphony Orchestra, I think. I'll have to look it up. Anyways, it just that's also wonderful, and it has a completely different sensibility than Dutoit and Montreal. It's sort of more earthy, right? But he gets a lot of the same things right, but of course sounding differently because they are British players of a different era and with different instructors raised in a different milieu of training and so on, and expectations of what you would hear up there on the stage. And this just is sort of like, one of those, bum, 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 bum. He's setting up the transition here, ending on this modulatory chord, this transition chord. So we're going to flats now, starting with E flat, and then A2 horns, A3 clarinets. And this is actually a really wonderfully hollow sound. Right now I am actually taking a break amongst furious activity on my Wins 103 course for Mac Pro Video, Ask Video, and wow, I just feel like I'm taking a break from a whirlwind. Anyhow, this is one of the things that I had to track down was a recording of clarinets playing A2, just so that you could hear what that sounds like. But there's a real band-like feel to this. This is the kind of thing that you would hear from like a military band or a wind band. And that is clarinets A3, horns A2, the sense of brass playing along with clarinet. Since both instruments are without vibrato, you just hear the very hollow, clear sound. And I just think that's a wonderfully spooky effect, but a lot of times developing orchestrators ask for A2 clarinets, and they're just not really even thinking. They're thinking, well, hey, I'll get a firmer sound, or I'll get a louder sound, or I'll get more stability or whatever with A2 this or A2 that. Not really thinking of the fact that adding a second instrument doesn't actually make things louder, right? It just makes things more solid. If you've got 10 clarinets on a part, yeah, of course it's going to be stronger. But A2 doesn't necessarily make it louder. A3, yeah. If everybody is doubling and tripling on the same notes, then yeah, of course it's going to be louder. But it's not really the goal, right? What we want here is a color. We don't necessarily crave stability or strength. That's an illusion, all right? What you're really looking for is color when you do that. So be aware of that and be aware of what that color is. So here we're getting into what looks like much more complex orchestration. And I'll say that to a degree, this is the kind of thing that keeps me on my toes in terms of analysis. Because indeed, the functions are getting more complex. So I have to sort of go through them and also talk about what the functions in the different parts of the orchestra do for the whole texture and balance and everything else. Okay, well, not too exhaustively, or else we'd be here for hours. There's so much to pick apart in this particular movement. But we can easily break down some of the functions, like, for instance, this kind of walking down idea here, and how the bassoons and contrabassoon take over. So second and third free up the cellos, so the cellos can join in octaves with the melody, with the first violins. And the bass clarinet first doubling the cellos on that theme, along with the first bassoon. And that is sort of maintaining a little bit of that kind of hollow feeling to a degree. It starts to get lost as soon as you double it with strings. It just fattens things and, you don't really think about it. I think it's very cool here that there is no doubling for the violins at all as they start off. I think that's cool. You get doubling from the winds on the melody when the seconds and violas come in octaves. Then as the music rises, we're seeing certain instruments come in to double the violins, for instance, here in octaves, continuing on with the cellos below. So we've got the clarinets in octaves, which is also has a very, very potent feeling, even when doubled by strings. And we see the second oboe coming in on that. Fattened up by the time we get to here by English horn. And, of course, bass oboe, basically just doubling the violas. That is a really cool doubling. Or actually, not cool, but very warm. A very warm doubling. And what I really love is the massiveness of this by the time it gets to here. Even though the orchestration is fairly simple, right? There are elements in the horns and trumpets that are providing a bit of a harmonic linchpin so that the motions can continue on and be nice and contrapuntal in a beautiful way. By the time you get here, the placement of those tones and their dynamic level really adds brilliance to everything that is going on here. All you've got to do is listen to it, and you can hear that. Almost scorching in a way, with the kind of impact that you would get from a massive tutti, and yet using very few instruments. And Holst is able to get away with this because he's got 3 clarinets, and he's got 4 oboists playing different oboe family members, and 3 bassoons and contrabassoon, and 4 trumpets. So he's able to get that massive sound, even though he's not using all his resources yet, though he soon will. Right? And this is pretty nice scoring, I would have to say. This is all very effectively done. It's implied here that this is going to be tenuto, but even if you're not reading it there on the page, here's where the violinists and everybody else is going to use long bows on everything. Just really just almost like a sword stroke. And that is going to come through beautifully. I love the way that we've got the doubling here in the upper winds for these upper string intervals or you could say chords that are being formed by the violins, and then echoed an octave lower in a different voicing for the second half of the bar, with the horns doubling once they get in reach, right? Same elements in the lower strings and lower winds, but since we're sort of telescoping the functions, there doesn't really need to be diminuendo till the very, very end of the bar. And that sets this up. Chord in the trombones, tuba coming in with a rare octave with the contrabassoons. This is a lovely idea right in here, with the two lowest instruments of two different sections playing octaves together. This is very effective. You're going to hear more tuba than you are contrabassoon, so the tuba player is going to have to pull their punch slightly if there is to be a balanced sound here, because it's all too easy for the contrabassoon to disappear underneath the force of the tuba if they really obey this and play pesante, really heavy. So these two players really have to listen to each other there. Let's have a listen to all of this. Kind of too much to go over at this point to remind you to listen to, but think of how the different instruments are doubling each other during this contrapuntal section. Think about how much support and force is being manifested here, even without using all of the resources of the orchestra. And listen for that octave in there. And also for this very hollow doubling of horns plus A3 clarinets. And also for the things that we talked about on the previous page. And I will see you on the next screen. Here at rehearsal figure 2, we run into yet more ideas that only work with incredibly sensitive players. So Holst must have known that he could count on players like that to score some of these things, because they fall apart so easily, as you might hear from some performances of this with less careful players. For instance, the whole idea of alternating these chords on harp along with timpani and double bass pizzicato. So the double bass pizzicato and the timpani are going to come through just perfectly with any orchestra. What's not so clear is whether or not these harps are going to be heard all that much. However, if you are very, very sensitive and the timpanist really does play piano and doesn't overdo it, then they'll come through beautifully. However, they are going to disappear from time to time, and some of this is a bit idealized, I feel, towards the end, whether this will really come through. These chords here against the upper winds, you'll hear some quality of it, but I feel that if it were incredibly important to Holst that there be that plucked quality to the upper winds, then it would have been better off to just add upper string pizzicato. But that's the perfectionist in me. And also the person who's heard so many times when the harps have just been swamped by simple forte playing in the winds. Going back to here, beautifully somber chord is really bringing, I feel this brings to a close the idea that started around rehearsal figure 1, that beautiful chorale of trombones. And it's answered by the instruments that helped to build the big tutti that we heard, that big effective tutti that wasn't even all of the instruments playing. They just kind of react and then fade off. Once again, I feel that this is another example of the idea of Saturn, the bringer of old age, of maturity, but also of letting go, right? That's the other side of the coin. You gain maturity, you gain wisdom, but you also have to learn to let go of things, right? And sometimes those are just our illusions, and sometimes those are like the functioning of our bodies, right? I just really love that intense chord and the way that it just leaches out its color as it goes diminuendo and gives way to this. Speaking of chorales, this is just a lovely, lovely idea. Here's an example of how lower register flute scoring can be terrifically effective, just so long as it has the right kind of accompaniment, right? So if you assume that the timpanists are really going to control their dynamic level and let the harps come through, and the pizzicato from the double basses isn't going to be too demanding. Right here, I would actually tell the players to put a pianissimo in their part right there, because even a firm pizzicato from double bass can also swamp, to a degree, some of the harp part. But if all that is controlled, then this is just a wonderful support for the flute chorale. And lovely way that the alto flute, not actually bass flute, is being used here to essentially play octaves in a lot of these chords. To reiterate, once again, our transposition, right? Think down a fourth. So if you think down a fourth, you can see that the alto flute is tracking the first flute at octaves, right? Typical 4-part harmony strategy, but still really, really cool with that alto flute sound. And it's also at its strongest in this kind of scoring. Some of these notes would only have been possible on the alto flute for a lot of flute players back then, before the B became standard. An octave lower than this would be B below middle C, and nowadays that would be pretty easy for your average concert flute player. But then, of course, you get down to here with concert G sharp, written C sharp for the alto flute, and that's way out of range for the C flute. Now, as the flutes crescendo and they start to rise, they get doubled by the clarinets starting to come in. English horn adding its voice to this G sharp right here, written D sharp. And more elements come in. Bass oboes playing the E at the bottom here of this right there, so doubling the bass flute. And the bass flute just sort of peters out here. Getting to this A flat here, at this point it's just totally not needed and is not going to be that effective. So the element that it was playing, this A flat right here, concert E flat, correct? Goes to English horn, and so on. So just this builds up bigger and bigger with no brass as yet, but just getting more and more pungent as it goes. And part of that pungency is the fact that the flutes and clarinets are doubling. So it just gives it a very punchy sound up there with our ears. And also, the oboe family is playing an octave lower and supporting from below. And then under that, we've got the bassoons. So that configuration has just this wonderful sound. And notice, not just no brass, but no upper strings. I feel that this is so punchy that it's very easy to lose the harps. They're being told to play forte here. I think fortissimo would get a balance if you were really to achieve that. But pizzicato on some of the same pitches as the second harp, that's going to blot out some of its effectiveness. And along with the upper winds, taking away the resonance of what happens after the pluck for the harp. So you might hear the pluck, but you won't really hear that generous sustained sound because it's being swallowed by the winds, even in the best of situations. Let's listen to how that works, and then I will see you on the next screen. Now here, at figure 3, we hear a little bit of sleight of hand. Once again, with Holst's intuition about the way that overtones work and the way that our ear focuses on certain effects. I feel this is among one of the strongest illusions that he puts in there. And that is that we've got this massive C minor chord right here in the upper winds, and clarinets and bassoons. And all that Holst has got to do to dovetail into that is have a C minor octave chord in the trumpets. This is something that I've referred to in the past when people have scored trumpets higher and higher and higher without any regard to whether or not it's playable for the trumpet, but just really, really worried that the part that they're scoring for the trumpet should stay in the same octave as other things that are going on. Here, Holst is just saying, well, I know that because of the way that the overtones of brass work, by really, really emphasizing what we're hearing an octave higher, that I can just come right in with this, and there won't be a feeling of dropping the pitch, right? So this is an example of that. Trumpets can sound an octave lower than other parts that they're interacting with, and not feel like they have necessarily dropped an octave. Okay, sometimes they can, but in this case, it's just a really wonderful giving over of massed winds to a simple 4-part trumpet harmony. Of course, we've got the horns pitching in there as well on the lowest note, right? So it just really is underlining that sense of force. Here we're having the lower brass, timpani, come in and start to play along with the lower strings. And they're joined by the bassoons. So this is going to be incredibly solid. Interestingly, this page here takes quite a while to get through because of the very slow tempo and the very deliberate procession that is going on here. And sometimes I've heard conductors throw in a bit of rubato here to give the players time to enunciate exactly to the hall and to the section and everything else. So you may hear that in one recording or another. There's a recording with score, for instance, on YouTube that is part of the playlist that I've got for this series of analysis videos. And you'll hear in that video that the conductor uses some rubato just to really make sure that everything is sitting exactly where it needs to sit and that the players are enunciating at the exact optimum amount for each of these massive chords. A few things to notice here. One is how Holst will double the top note in the trumpets from time to time, going back and forth between 3-part and 4-part harmony. So if you run into a situation like this, especially when you're headed for massive dynamics, then this is a really safe way of telescoping that extra part into a supported high note. Interesting how Holst just goes all the way up to that top C here. And this is a safe dynamic to do it with. It's much harder to play high notes at soft dynamics for most orchestral brass players and wind players too, except for maybe like bassoon. So this is pretty well scored dynamically. There has to be a little bit of restraint even here for the trombones, not to just really plow over everything else that is going on there. But it's nice to allow the brass to really go for it. They've been holding back all throughout this suite, except for a bit in Mars and a bit in Jupiter. And now they can just really go nuts as a section all together. Of course, in the next movement, Uranus, they also get to go crazy a bit. But it's all very effective scoring. Notice how some notes are doubled here in some of these voicings in the horns. And that's actually very safe as well. It helps to solidify things rather than just stretching every note apart in specific, predictable configurations. And right into the middle of that, Holst throws this alternating idea. Animato, and just kind of going back and forth. Bum, 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 bum. And there is a parallel with this in another movement, and that is in Mercury. I'm sure that the idea was sort of borrowed from Saturn and then introduced into Mercury, where it would resonate later on. There's the same thing going on there. Button, 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 button. Really lovely to see a tubular bell solo with metal striker. That is going to be an enormously clangy sound. Harps could just go home, though, at this point. See, this is one of those things where really, if the harps are in there, it's just so that they can feel like they're part of the music, because they're really not going to make that much difference at all unless they're being recorded and some engineer decides to turn them up a little bit so that you can hear them. Or you're sitting right next to them in the orchestra. You're not going to hear the harps at this volume. But it's still kind of cool. It's an optimistic idea. Interesting, too, how much force Holst gets out of the entire rest of the orchestra, plus horns, against the idea of that sort of plodding crescendo in the brass and strings and bassoons. So these two alternating textures are pretty amazing. There are a few things to notice here. One is that pretty much everything is doubled by the clarinets here. So you've got the oboes and the top line of flutes here, A3. That is the same as the first clarinet player. And, of course, the second oboist is getting this middle line here, and the English horn is doubling the bottom line of the clarinets. Something to think about with English horn and clarinet in B-flat, and that is that the writing of them is a fourth apart. So when you see the English horn up a fourth from a clarinet part, then they are both playing down on this lower note. So like down a fifth from the written note on English horn, down a major second in the clarinets, the B-flat clarinets. So that's another way. It's a little confusing at first, but you just get used to it after a while. So this massive chord really is summed up in the clarinets, and it's also being played by the violins in this really cool trading off of easy double stops, right? So you've got this open A and then a fingered B, and then the player can just reach over and change this to an A without anything down there, right? And then the second violins play an F and then a G6 with an E flat on top, right? So it's just really, really easy for them to realize this idea here, just spread out across them in a really convenient way. And let me tell you, when you're playing triple F on a string instrument, it's best to keep everything as simple and direct as possible. Okay, so just really remember that. Do not score triple F with all of these weird double stops and triple stops and so on. The player is just smashing their bow against the strings. You want to keep it simple. Okay? And then the violas are playing the little alternate, and they are being doubled by fewer instruments, but still very effective ones. Like we said before, the bells, the tubular bells, dude, and the horns, and bass oboe is contributing a little bit, but it's got to come in and join in with the theme, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So really, just the horns plus the violas are enough to fill in that gap perfectly, the little alternating rhythm. Now, let's talk about how we come back to our opening theme. First, we're seeing cellos contribute here a little bit to the little kind of idea, right? With a bit of bass clarinet and, as we said before, bass oboe. Once the whole pattern has been set up in the listener's mind, the part can be just completely taken away, and we will just continue to cruise on that expectation without even hearing those elements, right? Because we are easy to fool as listeners. F for the double basses, cellos, an octave higher. We've got the same exact pitches here in the bassoons and contrabassoon, with the third jumping in to the lower part here. These two, like the third bassoon and contrabassoon, playing the same notes because of the octave transposition of the contra, right? And they're being joined by bass clarinet just to firm up the upper line, and that's also being doubled by bass oboe. So it's going to be a massive, fat, thick sound. But if that weren't enough, the tuba is going to jump in there, bass tuba, and is going to double the bottom line. So it's tremendously firm and solid and conservative, right? It sort of has the cultural inertia. It's the force that gains power and tries to hold back things from moving forward too quickly, right? It's that sort of check that I feel is being expressed here. It has a certain amount of aggression, doesn't it? And I'm not speaking politically. I'm just speaking like culturally and emotionally, right? I would say the parents who want to hold back their kid from going too far too fast, or worry about them too much, or maybe enact strange laws that say you can't drink on a Sunday in the park, that kind of thing. So, yeah, it's that same kind of force. Really, really aggressive, the way that I see it. And this massive, massive statement here is answered by a single trumpet. I've been noticing here with these scores, especially in the more massive ones of Holst, about how he uses one fortissimo trumpet or one forte trumpet to answer an enormous texture or an enormous combined doubling. I'll just answer it with one trumpet. Now, in case you ever wondered what four trumpets playing all together sounded like, you'll hear that here. Just the fattest sound, and scorching sound too, fortissimo pushed, a four soli. That's something you really should listen for when we take a musical break in a minute. Right here, you hear the crashing Hollywood sound. This has been imitated so many times, especially in epic science fiction fantasy films. Massive, blasting, heavy brass. And that is essentially what I would call cuivre. Cuivre is usually scored as a marking for horns rather than heavy brass. But here, there's really no need to call it cuivre, that you're just going to get that effect at that volume. I love this underpinning B right here. That's just so awesome. Coming in here on the double basses, the tuba, of course, and then A3 bassoons and contrabassoon all on the same note. Like, it just is devastating, that underpinning note. This kind of culminates a lot of the ideas together, bum, bum, bum. But it also has a quality of these harmonies that came before, right? And then this is something that Holst will do a lot over the course of the entire suite. And interestingly, laid down here in his piece that is of the earliest sketches, right? So this strategy worked its way into the other movements. And that is to just repeat it quieter as a way of bringing the energy down. Right? So let's listen to all of those things, if you can remember them. Especially listen to this wonderful doubling in the way that it's answered by a single trumpet. I think that is just awesome scoring. And then, of course, to the quality of tone here with 4 trumpets just blasting right in their sweet spot. And then, of course, this massive thing is the payoff here. And the way that elements are repeated softer and lower. And this lovely tubular bell solo. I just think it's just so awesome. So listen for all of those elements, plus the ones on the page before, and I will see you on one more screen for this lecture. Here on this last screen for our lecture today, we see the flutes coming back to some of their original function of alternating chords, but notice that they are on the beat now. They're coming in on 3 and then 1 and 3 and 1 and so on. The more syncopated chords are being played by bassoons and harps, right? So bassoon and harp 2 alternating with flutes and harp 1. And I feel this is really, really an effective, beautiful type of scoring. Just really lovely. And especially with the tubular bell giving this little alternating idea all the way through there. Just really lovely. We are returning to some of the vibe of the very beginning because Holst is about to change the entire nature of this movement. So he wants to recap everything so you see where you've been. So the bass oboe returns, once again with the alternate of bass clarinet if a bass oboe isn't available. And then high cellos, this time doubled by violas, just to give it more of an intense sound. Notice he's saying he doesn't really want you to play out that much. So he's, bum, 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 and then just really, really die off quicker. Then that processional quality of trombone coming back with the tuba, playing the full idea, as originally stated by the double basses, solely unison and then octaves. There's really not a whole lot to say about this particular page, except for how it recaps what happened before, but reinterprets it by adding these bassoons and the harps kind of going back and forth against each other. I find that all just really beautifully done. And it's worth it just to look at this page on its own merits, even though it's so short. So have a listen to this. Listen for all of those elements I just mentioned. And I'll be back very, very soon here on Patreon. I'm essentially doing these all in a row and releasing them right away because I'm so busy with everything else. I don't know when I'll have a chance to do a whole lot of interaction or anything else. But I'm getting a lot of business out of the way here just on these 3 days that I'm taking off. The Patreon evaluations are coming up right away, and one or two other things that deal with other projects that are going on from past months. And I'm just taking care of them all at once and adding it all, and then I'm going to be finishing up the more hands-on work that has to do with my Orchestration 103 course. Actually, it's really enjoyable, but it's completely compelling, completely blots out everything else. And it's very hard to do things around the edges, which is why I'm just taking these days off to do this now. So anyway, forget about that. Just enjoy this, listen along, read along, and I will be back with the second half of this lecture on Saturn.